The train screeched to a halt somewhere in the flat, golden fields of Kansas. Dust swirled through the air as the doors opened, and sunlight hit the faces of the weary German prisoners inside. Among them stood Liesel Bauer, a 24-year-old typist from Hamburg who had been drafted into clerical service and captured in France. She had imagined barbed wire, shouting guards, and cold rations waiting for her in America. Instead, she saw quiet. The landscape was wide and still, dotted with wheat fields and windmills that turned lazily in the summer heat. The air smelled of earth, not smoke. The guards, wearing khaki uniforms and calm expressions, gestured politely for the women to step down. One even offered a canteen of water. "This is Camp Wilson," the officer announced. "You'll be processed, assigned quarters, and given work duties. You'll find the rules are simple: respect and cooperation." Liesel exchanged glances with her friend Greta, a nurse with a sharp tongue and tired eyes. "Respect?" Greta whispered. "From them?" Liesel didn't answer. She didn't trust anything that sounded kind. Inside the camp, there were wooden barracks lined neatly, with flower beds along the paths. Someone had painted the fences white. It felt more like a school than a prison. Liesel expected this to be a trick, that the cruelty would come later when they least expected it. That night, she lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the guards were laughing softly, one of them playing a harmonica. The sound floated through the camp, haunting, almost beautiful. Greta turned over. "Do they mock us with their music?" Liesel listened closely. The melody wasn't mocking, it was sad. "No," she said quietly. "I think they remember home." Days passed, and life in the camp followed a rhythm. The women were given uniforms, breakfast at dawn, and work assignments, cooking, cleaning, tea, tending to a vegetable patch. The guards remained calm, almost gentle. It unsettled Liesel more than cruelty ever could. One afternoon, a young American lieutenant named Daniel Hayes entered the women's barracks carrying a box. "We've got something for you," he said, his tone light. He opened the box. Inside were books, German books. The women stared. "You expect us to read propaganda?" Greta scoffed. Hayes shook his head. "No, literature, Goethe, Schiller, a bit of Rilke. Someone back home thought you might miss your language." Liesel stepped forward slowly, her eyes wide. "You brought these? For us?" He nodded. "A library's being set up in the recreation hall. You can borrow them." A silence hung in the room. Then Liesel asked, "Why?" The lieutenant smiled faintly. "Because even enemies need stories." That night, the women gathered around the first few books, touching the worn covers like sacred objects. It had been months since any of them had held a novel. Liesel opened Faust and read the first line aloud. The words felt strange on her tongue, heavy with memory, yet warm with life. Greta snorted. "We're prisoners, and they give us poetry." Liesel smiled faintly. "Perhaps they know what keeps people sane." Weeks later, the camp held its first music evening. The American chaplain had convinced the command to let the prisoners form a small choir. They gathered in the recreation hall, a simple wooden building with benches, a piano, and faded flags on the wall. When the lights dimmed, the first notes of Ave Maria filled the room. The women's voices rose, trembling at first, then steady, pure. The sound carried through the open windows, out into the Kansas night. Outside, the American guards stopped what they were doing. Some leaned against the fence, listening. One took off his cap. It was the sound of something older than war, a sound that reminded them all of mothers, of churches, of peace. When the song ended, no one clapped, no one moved. The silence that followed was more powerful than applause. Later, as the women returned to their barracks, Liesel saw Lieutenant Hayes waiting by the door. "You sing beautifully," he said. She shrugged. We sang before the bombs, too. The world just didn't listen. Hayes nodded slowly. Maybe it's listening again. Over the next months, the camp's library grew. American Red Cross volunteers brought more books, English novels translated into German, even music sheets. The women spent hours reading and talking, their conversations slowly shifting from bitterness to curiosity. Some began learning English, others helped the guards with translation. Liesel started teaching basic literacy to younger prisoners who had never finished school. In the evenings, she'd sit by the fence, reading aloud to Greta. One night she said, "Do you ever think we'll go home?" Greta sighed. "If there's a home left." Liesel closed the book. "Then perhaps we'll build one from words." One rainy afternoon, a group of American soldiers entered carrying something large under a tarp. The prisoners watched as they revealed an upright piano, slightly battered but beautiful. "Gift from the townspeople," Hayes explained. "They figured you'd make better use of it." The women gathered around, hesitant. Liesel touched the keys. They were cool, ivory, perfect. "Who will play?" someone asked. A voice spoke up from the back. Anna Weber, a quiet former music teacher. She sat down, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. Then she began to play. First a lullaby, soft and slow, then the opening bars of Clair de Lune. The sound filled the room like light breaking through clouds. Even the rain outside seemed to hush. Liesel felt tears slide down her cheeks, uninvited, unstoppable. Around her, women who had seen bombings, hunger and loss now closed their eyes and smiled. For the first time in years, they remembered what beauty sounded like. When the last note faded, Hayes whispered, "You just made this whole camp feel human again." That night, Liesel wrote in her journal, something she had started keeping since the books arrived. "They gave us music, they gave us stories, and somehow between the pages and the notes I found myself again. Maybe freedom begins not with gates opening, but with hearts softening." She paused, looked around the quiet barracks where women slept peacefully, and added one final line. "Perhaps forgiveness sounds like a piano." If this story touched your heart, subscribe to WWII Relics Explained and hit the bell, because sometimes the most powerful weapons in history were not guns, but kindness. Spring came early that year. The Kansas wind, once cold and sharp, turned gentle and warm. Inside Camp Wilson, flowers began to bloom along the fences, wild daisies, planted secretly by the prisoners during their morning walks. They were small, fragile, and free in a way the women could not yet be. By then, the library hall had become the beating heart of the camp. Books lined the wooden shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines worn from use. Music sheets hung from pegs, and a piano sat proudly by the window, always surrounded by women humming softly or flipping through notes. Liesel had started organizing weekly readings, something the guards called Book Sundays. Each week, one woman would read aloud from a chosen story and share what it meant to her. It wasn't about the books anymore. It was about remembering that they were still thinkers, dreamers, and human. One Sunday, Liesel stood at the front holding a thin copy of The Little Prince. "This is not about war," she told the room. "It's about a boy who travels among stars. And I think, after all we've seen, we could use a little starlight." She began to read, her voice low and steady. The other women listened, some smiling, some weeping quietly. Even the guards by the door lay in. When she reached the part where the prince says, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye." The hall went silent. For a moment there were no prisoners and no guards, only people who remembered what it was like to feel. That evening, Lieutenant Hayes approached Liesel as she closed up the library. "You ever think about what you'll do when you go home?" he asked. She thought for a long moment. I don't know if home still exists. My city is gone. My family too, maybe. But I'll rebuild. Maybe start a library of my own. He smiled. You'd make a good librarian? She laughed softly. Because I like books? No, he said. Because you make people want to read them. He handed her a small notebook. From the officer's supply, blank pages. You can write your own stories now. Liesel took it like it was made of glass. You trust me with this? Hayes shrugged. We trusted you with a piano. A notebook's a small risk. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The women who had once spent their days in silence or bitterness now gathered to sing, paint, and read. Laughter returned to the camp, tentative at first, then natural. The guards started joining in. Some of them brought harmonicas, one even brought a violin from the nearby town. They held music nights where prisoners and soldiers performed together, trading songs from both sides of the ocean. When Anna played Beethoven's Ode to Joy, one of the American sergeants joined on harmonica, turning the solemn melody into something brighter, something that sounded like hope learning to walk again. The women clapped and sang until their voices cracked. Afterward, Liesel told Greta, if someone had told me last year that I would sing with Americans, I would have called them mad. Greta smirked. And now? Now, Liesel said softly, I call it peace. Not everyone approved. Word spread through nearby American towns that the POWs were being treated too kindly. Some families who had lost sons in Europe were tragède. Why are they singing while our boys lie in graves? One widow demanded in a town meeting. The base commander, Colonel Reeves, drove to the camp himself. He arrived during a music session. From outside, he heard the women's voices, soft and pure, blending with the piano. When he stepped inside, everything stopped. The prisoners froze. Liesel stood beside the piano, her hands clasped. Reeves looked around and said quietly, Continue. They hesitated. Then Anna began playing again. Ave Maria. Reeves listened, his face unreadable. When it ended, he said, I lost my brother in the Ardennes. He loved this song. Then he turned to Hayes. You're doing good work here. Let it continue. The next morning, he ordered that the camp receive more supplies, paint for the hall, new books for the shelves. If peace is ever going to mean anything, he told Hayes, it has to start where hate used to live. By summer, the camp had changed completely. It was no longer a place of punishment, but of learning. Women attended language classes, painted murals, even wrote letters to their families in Germany, letters that the Red Cross helped deliver. For many, it was the first contact with home in years. Some wept when they learned their loved ones had survived. Others wept when they didn't. One evening, Liesel sat by the fence, notebook open on her lap. She could hear Greta singing softly inside the hall. Hayes came over and leaned against the post. What are you writing tonight? Liesel smiled faintly. A story. About what? About a place where prisoners built a library and the guards learned to read with them. He laughed. That sounds like a fairy tale. Maybe, she said. But maybe fairy tales are just truths that take longer to happen. Then, one morning, the notice came. The war in Europe had been over for months, and the repatriation orders had arrived. The women would be sent home. The camp erupted in mixed emotions, joy, fear, sorrow. They had dreamt of freedom for years, but now freedom meant leaving behind the strange safety they had built. That night, the women gave one final concert. They sang Silent Night in both German and English. The Americans joined in, their voices blending into one trembling chorus that echoed far beyond the barbed wire. Even the stars seemed to listen. Afterward, Liesel approached Hayes. You will forget us, she said. He shook his head. Not a chance. You'll go home, start a life. So will you, he said gently. And one day you'll tell this story. And maybe someone will believe that war didn't win. She handed him her notebook. Then keep this, so you don't forget. He hesitated. It's your writing. I'll start a new one, she said, smiling. This one belongs here. The next morning, the buses arrived. The women climbed aboard, carrying small bundles of clothes and books the Americans had given them as gifts. As the engines roared to life, Anna sat by the window holding the piano sheet for Claire de Lune. Liesel pressed her hand against the glass, looking out at Hayes. He stood by the gate, hand raised in salute. When the bus began to move, the women started singing. Quietly at first, then louder, the melody of Ode to Joy floating through the dusty air until it disappeared over the horizon. And in the camp, now quiet once more, Hayes walked into the empty library. The books were still there. So was the piano. On the table sat the notebook Liesel had given him. He opened it and read the first line. Even in captivity, a heart can be free. He closed the book and whispered, You were right. The Atlantic shimmered like broken glass under the morning sun as the ship carrying the German POWs approached Europe. It had been 2 weeks since they left Kansas, 2 weeks of silence, waves, and memories that clung to their thoughts like salt on skin. For Liesel, every sunrise felt like a page turning, one chapter closing, another uncertain one waiting to be written. She sat on the deck wrapped in a blanket, her hair tousled by the wind. Greta stood beside her, watching gulls follow the ship's wake. Strange, Greta said. I dreamed of coming home for years, but now that I am, it doesn't feel like victory. Liesel nodded. Maybe peace is never victory. Maybe it's just learning to breathe again. When the ship docked in Bremen, the women were greeted not with parades, but with silence. Germany was unrecognizable. Cities flattened, families scattered, hope fragile. Liesel walked through the streets of Hamburg days later, seeing what once had been her world now reduced to brick dust and memory. Her old apartment was gone. In its place, weeds grew among the rubble. She found shelter with distant relatives in a small village outside the city. Every night she'd sit by the window, staring at the horizon, remembering the quiet of the Kansas plains, the smell of library wood, the sound of the piano echoing through the camp. She missed it, not the captivity, but the humanity that had bloomed inside it. One afternoon she unpacked her small trunk and found the single book she had kept, Faust, the first she had borrowed from Camp Wilson's library. Inside the cover, she discovered a note she didn't remember placing. For when you start your own library, D.H. Her eyes welled up. Hayes. He had written it before she left. And suddenly she knew. She couldn't let that promise remain unkept. Months later, Liesel approached the local mayor with a bold idea to open a small community library, one where people could borrow books freely, German, English, or whatever could be found. People need words again, she told him. They need something that reminds them we are more than ashes. The mayor, weary and skeptical, asked, And who will give us these books? The Allies have taken everything. Then I'll ask them to give back stories instead of guns. Wrote letters to the Red Cross, to American relief offices, even to the U.S. Army Information Unit in Frankfurt. For months, there was no answer. Then, one morning, a truck arrived from the city. The driver handed her a note written in English. From friends across the sea, Books for Peace, U.S. Army Education Corps. When they opened the crates, Liesel gasped. Inside were hundreds of books, German translations, dictionaries, novels, even sheet music. At the bottom of one crate lay a small notebook bound in worn leather. She recognized it instantly, her notebook, the one she had given to Lieutenant Hayes. Inside the first page was a single line in his handwriting. "You said you'd start a new one. I thought you might want this one back." Liesel pressed the book to her chest and whispered, "He remembered." The library opened that spring in 1948, inside a rebuilt schoolhouse. On the first day, only 3 children came. On the second, 10. By the end of the month, the room was full. People came from nearby towns to read, listen to music, or simply sit in peace. Liesel arranged the books carefully, German on the left, English on the right, and in the middle a single shelf labelled "No Borders." She taught reading classes to widows, orphans, and former soldiers. She played piano for the children on weekends. Sometimes she'd tell them stories from America, about the camp, the library, the kind soldier who had believed that even prisoners deserved poetry. When asked why she cared so much about books, she'd smile and say, "Because books remind us that every story can end differently." Years passed. The world changed again. By the early 1960s, Liesel's library had become a cornerstone of the town. A new building was constructed, brick and glass, with tall windows that let sunlight spill across the shelves. The American consulate donated funds for its expansion, and one day an invitation arrived addressed to Mrs. Liesel Bauer, Librarian of Peace. It was from the U.S. Embassy in Bonn, inviting her to attend a cultural exchange, event on post-war reconciliation. Liesel was hesitant, but curiosity, and something deeper, convinced her to go. The event was held in a bright hall lined with flags. When she arrived, a young American man approached her, introducing himself in fluent German. "My name is Michael Hayes," he said. "My grandfather served at Camp Wilson. He used to tell me stories about a German woman who could make a prison sound like a classroom." Liesel's breath caught. "Your grandfather, Daniel Hayes?" Michael nodded. "He passed 2 years ago, but he kept this." He handed her a photograph, a faded image of Liesel standing beside the piano, reading aloud to a room full of women. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "She turned a camp into a library. She taught me peace." Tears filled her eyes. "He never forgot." Michael smiled. "He said you reminded him that war ends when people start listening again." That night, as the event concluded, Liesel stood on the balcony overlooking the river. The moon reflected off the water just as it had on those Kansas nights. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, my friend." In 1970, Liesel retired. The library she founded was renamed the Bauer-Hayes Center for Peace and Literature, honoring both her and the man who had helped her rediscover humanity. Visitors from around the world came to see it, students, veterans, historians. On the wall near the entrance hung a quote in both German and English. "Even in captivity, a heart can be free." Below it sat the original piano from Camp Wilson, restored and polished. Once a month, local musicians played Clair de Lune in her memory. When Liesel passed away in 1984, the town mourned her not as a prisoner, but as a builder of peace. Her tombstone bore no dates of war, only a single inscription: "She gave back the music." Decades later, a filmmaker visited the library while researching WWII too. He asked the curator why the building was so quiet, almost sacred. The curator smiled and said, "Because sometimes silence is the sound of forgiveness." The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it. The young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together. The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it, the young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning, and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together. The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it, the young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning, and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together. The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it, the young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he too thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning, and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together. The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it, the young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning, and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together. The filmmaker noticed the piano by the window and the old photo above it, the young woman reading to a hall full of prisoners, her face calm, her eyes alive. Beneath the photo, a brass plaque read, "Dedicated to those who proved that freedom begins where understanding is born." And as he stood there, sunlight streaming through the windows, he thought he could almost hear it, faint but clear, the sound of pages turning, and a soft melody echoing from somewhere far away, where enemies once sang together.